For those of you, lots of you will know who we are, lots of you will not know who we are. So we are an employee engagement partner. We have an awesome platform, but we do a lot of the consulting work around that, really helping organisations build listening strategies with lots of effectiveness. So we are really proud that we're a recognised authority. Lots of our research has been published in places such as Forbes, Yahoo Finance, Personnel Today. And if we just move forward a slide, Jodie, thank you. We're working with lots of fab clients in a whole variety of different industries. So really, it's not only to say, trust us, we know what we're doing. It's that we can really share some interesting perspectives amongst a variety of different sectors.
Brilliant. Thanks, Lucy. So before we jump in, I'll just quickly run over the things we're going to cover. As Lucy mentioned, we are going to have a really good look at what our research is showing around the data, why emotions drive those decisions, moving on to the more practical side of how to make a difference. We'll have some time for questions in there as well, as Lucy mentioned at the start, so please do ask on anything as we're going through, and then we'll come back to summarise everything we've been through at the end. So I'm Jodie, as Lucy mentioned, and I'll be passing over to Paula shortly. But why today's topic? I'm really excited to be able to share some really incredible data with you and insights with you all. But before we really jump into the nitty-gritty of that, I think it's important to look at why are we focusing on the human connection? Why are we taking this angle? Why are we putting this alongside retention and saying that it's the key to retaining people? So what we have here is the top 2 reasons for why people leave organisations. It's super powerful in itself that we know this and we know why people are leaving. Number 1, perhaps not surprisingly, this is all about career development, growth, learning, or a lack thereof, if you like. But the second reason, this one, is all down to that line manager relationship. So you may ask, well, why are we focusing on the second, which is more around relationship and connection? We've got to look at what can we control? What is within our influence? So this is the one where we think that we can focus and really influence people, whereas the first is more around what opportunities are there. Of course, there's things we can do, promote pathways and things like that. But we've all heard that old saying as well, people leave managers, not jobs. So this is what we're going to look at today. And we're going to come on with that with Paula, looking at how we can really use that connection and build that connection. So I mentioned that we've got some really insightful data that's going to help us know exactly where to focus. And just to quickly run through what we're going to cover in terms of the data and what we're looking at, we'll just touch on the context just to sort of set the scene so you know where it's from, what we're looking at. Then we'll look at how we can identify who these populations are, who is actually at risk of this leaving, who are we talking about and who are we trying to connect with, is of course why we need to know that. Why are we focusing on retention at all? What's its relationship to engagement? We're going to take this a level deeper, which is looking into how people are feeling. So this is the emotions, the themes, so that's the key reasons behind why people are feeling the way they do. And then we'll come on to what other factors are at play there. So all of the data that we're going to look at, it's all Inpulse data from across our clients. It's all from the last 2 years. And we've got, for this data, there's approximately 40,000 points of data. It's global and across a variety of sectors as well. So for the purpose of today as well, to really get to the heart of the retention issue, we're focusing on data from surveys where a retention style question, if you like, has been asked. So some examples of those you can see at the top. So it's something like, I intend to still be working here in 12 months' time. And then we can look at the populations by those who've answered it positively and those who've answered it negatively, indicating that they're planning to leave. So as you can see here, from our data, 13% of employees are answering a retention style question negatively, which they're basically telling us they're planning to leave. And actually, when we compare these to external turnover rates, we've got some just to reference at the bottom here, Monster and Glassdoor, we've got 15 and 12% there. we can see that we're sort of in the middle or thereabouts in terms of these numbers. So what we're really saying and how these connect up is that people that tell us they're going to leave, they're very much likely that they then do go on to leave. So this just gives some validity, if you like, to what we're looking at, because we know that this matches up. We know that this question is being answered by people who likely are the ones that then go on to leave. And in a way, we can take this as a really encouraging message, because actually people are giving us that information. It's right there, it's in front of us. We just need to look at it and then, of course, move it to the next step and do something about it. So I just want to demonstrate to you here the level of insight that we can get from this data. And this is the type of thing that we share with our clients around this data so that we can move it to the next level. Just to briefly explain what we're seeing here, I know there's a lot on the screen, but just in terms of what we're looking at, the data in the cells that you're seeing here with all the colours is answers to this retention question about whether people see themselves working at the organisation in 12 months' time. So if you're seeing a green or particularly dark green colour, then we've got a particularly high or particularly positive score. Whereas if you're looking at the orange or red in some cases as well, then the scores are much lower. Down the left-hand side, you can see that we've got different areas of the business. And across the top, we've got different ways of delving into that data, such as demographics, length of service. So this really helps us hone in on those pockets of people of where there might be people who are at risk. It's great knowing that overall we've got 13% that are likely to leave, but actually we need to know who they are. Where are those 13% within the business? We need to be able to target the efforts we're going to make as well. So knowing which population is really helpful, particularly when we're talking about connection, because how we connect with an employee, let's say in the first year, who's just joined the company, is going to be very different to how we connect with somebody who's been there a long time. Same with different age brackets, ethnicities potentially as well, which we see on here too. So I'll just point out one or two on here because just to note how we can use this. So for example, if we're looking at age, we can pretty quickly see that this column we've got, I know it's quite small, but 31 to 40 down here. This is nearly all sort of orange and almost red in some cases. So this is showing a kind of, there's something going on in this age group where that we may want to investigate further. And the even better thing about these heat maps is what we can do. We know how many people it is. We now know who and where they are within the business. But what we can do is click through on those particular populations and see exactly why it is that they're planning to leave, because we can look at why, the reasons that they give us, and look at their emotions, how they're feeling as well. So this can be really powerful. It's also really powerful to match up to things like attrition data, if you do have that information already, because it may be that you know the demographics of who's leaving, and it may be that you know it's everybody between the age of 20 and 30, let's say, but you don't know why. So you need to look at that population, and you can do that here and say, there they are. How are those people feeling, the people that we know are leaving, for example? So let's delve into this. And before we look at that, how are they feeling, I want to touch on this relationship that we have between engagement and retaining people. So just to explain what we're seeing here as well, in the middle, this 66%, this is across the data that we're looking at. This is the Inpulse average engagement index score for these surveys that we've got this data from. If we look over to the left-hand side at 88%, this is the engagement index score for people who've answered the retention question positively. Let's compare that over to the right-hand side. We've got 36%. That's the engagement index score for people who have answered the retention question negatively. I think what's really important to remember here, and it's really key, is that actually this 36% only represents 13% of people in this case. So actually you can see what a huge impact those people that are going to leave, what effect they're having on these overall scores. So if we can shift the dial on that, connect with this small population, but this 13% that are having this impact, we've got such a huge opportunity. And I know there's so many organizations that if I said to them, oh, well, if we sort out retention, your engagement index is going to jump up by 20% or more, they would be astounded. That is exactly what they're looking for. So this is really showing this correlation, how strong it is, and why we need to address this issue. It's quite staggering, these figures, really. The second sort of major insight that I want to pull out here is this incredibly close correlation that we've got between the engagement scores and the positive emotion scores. We can see they are pretty much the same here. So what we know, and why this is really powerful, is we know that emotions are what drive behavior. Emotions, how we feel, that's the leading indicator. That's what influences how we behave, all the things we do. So that's then having this knock-on effect on engagement and on our decisions of whether we stay or leave the organisation that we're working with. So it just shows how important it is that we ask that question, that we find that out, so that we can make that connection as well. So moving on from that, let's have a look. How are people feeling? And important here that we balance it. We've got both sides. Really important that we look at both the positive side and the more negative side. So in the green on the left-hand side, these are the top emotions for people who indicated that they're likely to stay, who have answered positively, that they do see themselves continuing to work at the organisation. Whereas on the left-hand side, the negatives, that's people who've indicated that they're likely to leave. Stark contrast, we can see that comes out straight away, perhaps not surprisingly. But on the negative side, this says it all, really, and this is why this conversation today is so timely, so relevant, so necessary. Right at the top there of the negative emotions, disconnected. I mean, that's how this all links together. That will go on to explain everything else that we're going to look at and how that links up. And we need to, of course, know why, which we're going to look further into as well, so that we can focus on that and build that connection. Really interesting as well that we've got irritated and anxious next. Again, these are very strong negative emotions. We're not seeing things come up like indifferent or bored. Irritated and anxious, disconnected, they're all really powerful. And actually, particularly, I want to draw on disconnected and anxious, because if we look at those two, we're speaking of a well-being issue here, really. Those both speak volumes to people who potentially are not feeling cared for, and we're going to come on to that as well, because that's it remains a hot topic at the moment around well-being. So we will come back to that. It not only appears in the themes down below, which you can see, but we will see that as we move on also. So just to quickly touch on that left-hand side, that positive side, valued at the top, we'll come back to that as well. I think we've got some great insights to share with you with Paula later on about how we can use that and why that's important. Committed and motivated. And the next level on here is all around the themes. So this is why people are feeling the way they do. So for the positive side, overwhelmingly, it's commitment. That is why people stay in their organisation. They are committed. And it might seem obvious in a way, because actually what drives commitment in pretty much every aspect of our lives, including personal lives, is feeling connected to something, whether it's people, a place, an organisation, whatever it might be. Building that connection leads to commitment, and those are the reasons why people are staying. And that's what is overwhelmingly coming out of our data. Interestingly, when we sort of compare this to the negative side and those themes behind why people are leaving, what we actually find here is that it's a lot more organisation dependent what the reason is. It's overwhelmingly this disconnected emotion that's coming out, but the specific reason why someone might feel that way is much more context dependent. So that's where having this we've got this great algorithm on our platform which will analyze how people feel, the reasons behind it, and can give you these themes so that you can see, oh, for my organization it's line manager or workload or whatever it might be.
Yeah, Jodie, let's just really highlight that, because it is a fab feature of the platform, and probably one of my favorite, because all of your free text answers from organizations that sometimes have, thousands and thousands of free text responses will be categorized for you. So it saves clients lots of time, and it really kind of helps their focus to understand that. So it's all manual. Again, giving you the real key areas of focus there. So I just wanted to really highlight that key point.
No, absolutely. Thanks, Lucy. And yeah, it's incredibly powerful that we can look at the data and this is pulled out for us. This is the why. This is what people are asking for. This is we know people are leaving, or why, and it's right here for us. So it is, as you say, incredibly insightful and powerful. So we've got this on the emotions, but I want to link this in to what other factors are at play. So let's have a look here. We've got some key engagement factors, if you like, or question themes from our surveys down the left-hand side here. Probably no surprises there in these topics, as they're all very key topics. And what we're looking at in terms of the numbers that we're seeing here, these are the scores for the questions based on how people have answered that retention question. So I've pulled out these particular themes, as these are the ones which have the strongest correlation with the retention question. So these are those areas where, if you like, we can say, if you see a score start to drop on one of these, or if you've got a low score to begin with, this is where an early warning sign for you. This is saying there's an issue here, there's something that's not connecting which needs addressing. So what we can also see from these scores, I'm not going to pull them out individually, because I think you can see the numbers, they speak for themselves. The gap between them is huge. It's incredible, this impact that people's intentions, how they're feeling, is having on these aspects of engagement. So what we're really saying here is, actually, let's forget the retention question in a way. These will tell you what people's intentions are anyway. We don't even need to explicitly say, are you planning to stay or go? If we know how they feel and why, we know the answer already. We can pull that out ourselves. So just a few of these I want to touch on, because I do want to link them up to those emotions. And I think this would be really important to have this in mind as we move into what Paula's going to share with us as well. So just to quickly touch on pride, for example, we can immediately take that one and think, oh, we saw commitment as one of the top emotions. Those two link very closely, particularly when we look around one of those top themes was around people feeling committed to the organisation as to why they stay. Valued was the top positive emotion for why people stay. And I think you'd agree, to a certain extent, we could link all of these themes to people feeling valued in some way. So inclusion, of course, feeling that sense of belonging, that you're valued, that your opinion, that you're valued in that way, links, of course, into things like recognition, valued for your contribution, people feeling that you're invested in, so career development there as well. But the one that I mentioned before that I do want to come back to on that negative side was around well-being. So we saw disconnected and anxious in those top two, which speak of that something going on there around well-being. And this is such a big part of being able to connect with people. Because as you'll know from any aspect of your life, feeling that connection comes hugely down to feeling like somebody cares. So I think we can say that there's two key reasons almost behind this, behind well-being coming up here. And we've actually seen, what's really interesting with the data as well, just over the last couple of years, is that these two questions on well-being, so if we take well-being and work-life balance together, scores for both of these have significantly dropped in the last over the last year, which the reasons behind that, if we pull them out, it's really things around, we've had so much change, so many, of course, the pandemic, adapting to hybrid working, all these kind of things, so much going on that actually what it means to feel cared for has changed. What used to be offered is not sufficient anymore. We need to find a new way to connect and make people feel cared for, because old offerings, they're not really enough. And I think this links into who we've got in the workforce as well, because if we look at Gen Z, for example, they really value things like a more personalised approach. So corporate initiatives are not really going to fly here on making people feel cared for, making that connection. So people are really expecting a more human approach to this as well. So from here, what can we do? Where can we really focus to make a difference? I'm going to pass over to Paula, who is going to talk a little bit more around how connection is really critical for these areas that we've highlighted here.
Thank you, Jodie. And it's really lovely to be here with you all. And I'm dying to get to the section where we kind of create a bit of dialogue. But before we get there, let me just build on that a little bit with a so what. And a couple of things that I wanted to highlight here, really. So that's the data. And what that data probably reinforces for many of you, and I've been in the people space for many years, as Lucy said at the beginning, is an intuitive understanding that we've always had, that those things are important, that these things are important. But having the evidence and data to be able to put that into the language of an organisation, to therefore think about, well, what do we do that makes a difference, I think is actually really important to be able to drive a dialogue, not from just intuitive understanding, but from evidence. So I think that's really, really important for those of us who are trying to drive this agenda. And here on the screen, I just picked 3 examples of us just stepping back a minute. So just stepping back a minute and just reminding ourselves, and this will be a refresher for everybody, but just why does emotion drive decisions? And it's the basis of behavioural science or behavioural economics. And if you look at this, you know, this has been happening to us in the marketing arena forever. So what marketeers understand is that in order for us to behave in a certain way, to buy something in the first place, attraction into an organisation, or to continue to be a customer, retention of customer is not any different to retention of employee. It's a sense of us feeling like we are part of something. It's hugely driven by how we feel. So I don't know if any of you remember this gorilla back from the 1990s, I think it is, but you know, this gorilla playing the drums, advertising Cadbury's Dairy Milk. The Cadbury's Dairy Milk was never ever shown on screen. It was just the purple. So there's something there about colour and being able to attend to our emotions at a deeper level. And then there was something just really a bit weird and a bit funky and a bit interesting going on. And we wanted to be part of it. So we bought in because we wanted to be part of something, nothing to do with chocolate. The second one you might recognise from Christmas last year. This is the John Lewis advert. I mean, John Lewis do it every year. They bring out an advert that pulls at the heartstrings. Don't really talk about John Lewis at all. They might feature a few products subliminally, but basically the message is, if you are buying from us, this is the feeling that we're going to create. We buy into the feeling. And the other example I've got up there is a Louis Vuitton bag. Why would you buy that? Why would you buy something that costs, 10, 15 times more than a hold-all you could probably buy on any other large retail online brand that would probably do exactly the same thing? It's signifying something about us. So we walk around with that and we might feel a sense of pride, a sense of belonging. It says something about us. It's an emotional connection. So marketeers have been focusing on emotion and helping us to feel connected to brands and decisions we make through emotion forever. And that is no different to what we've been doing within organisations when we talk about employer brand. So that's one thing to think about in terms of why emotions drive decisions. The next bit, I just pull up my next visual, is thinking about this also from a neuroscience perspective. So again, many of you will have probably been really deeply interested in the rise and rise of the scientific evidence that is now coming out that helps to support behaviour and behaviour more broadly, but also obviously behaviour in the workplace. So neuroscience would obviously say that we have a fight or flight response. So, you know, we've got our prefrontal cortex developed way later than our primeval brain. But when we feel connected or disconnected at a social level, and social level is one of the base requirements for humans' existence, because if you go back to us as, you know, our ancestors, you know, being part of the team, being part of the community, the tribe was essential to our survival. So therefore, not feeling part of the tribe has an effect on us in terms of how we feel connected, and therefore how stressed we feel. It, you know, creates a fight or flight result, creates emotion within us. And that emotion is then helping to drive decisions for us. So again, I'm, you know, just really wanting to hook us back into where this already exists. And then my final point on this slide is therefore, that is about, as I say at the bottom there, invoking the employer brand. So we have been talking about employer brand for years. Employee value proposition, employer brand, what does it really mean? And the retention question, attraction and retention are obviously the outcomes of a very strong employer brand, and then productivity within, you know, a thriving workforce. But I think what we're really getting to the crux of here, and the data helps us to do, is have a much more specified conversation about what does it actually mean to invoke the employer brand. It takes it from being an ethereal conversation about how people feel into something which we can actually measure and we can see the outcomes for. So that we know emotion drives decisions because of neuroscience and because of behavioural science. And that is where our basis is for invoking our employer brand. So Jodie already touched on this a little bit, but I just wanted to return to this because I think there's something really, really important about the point of human connection that is a sort of a deeper level of this conversation than a surface level understanding that, oh yes, it's about human connection. Well, why? And all of those 6 things that Jodie pulled up, that we have the evidence through all of our collective data to share, which says if people are going to stay, they feel like this. If people are going to leave, they feel like this, or they don't feel like this. It all comes down fundamentally to, you know, these fundamental feelings of human connection. So first of all, about feeling valued. You know, when I have career development, I feel like there is investment in me. I feel like I am valued here. I feel I am wanted here. I can contribute now and in the future. Obviously, same for recognition. Inclusion and pride is all about belonging. You know, when I buy into some of those organisations that we've just spoken about that's selling to us, I'm feeling included. You know, I'm feeling part of something. And that's exactly the same in organisations. And that sense of belonging, if you go back to some of that, don't go back, but if we go back to that slide on some of the data, when you refer back to it later, it's 54% on inclusion. You know, it's massive. That's over half the population saying, if I don't feel included, I'm not connected here. There's nothing tethering me to this organisation. And even if I didn't answer the retention question to say that I was leaving, you know, of which that 54% is indicative, what about the percentage of people that might not feel that they belong, that might not be actively saying that, but an opportunity comes along and they get swayed over there because that does appeal to their emotional side. So emotions are super important. And I wanted to talk about safety as well, because this really is the basis for the work-life piece of feedback that we get and the well-being piece. Workload, we often have action plans that come out of engagement surveys around workload that tackles the issue of workload. But in actual fact, the issue of workload often is actually a feeling of safety. It's a feeling of being able to say, I can cope, I can say no to things, you know, all of those things that we say exist within organisations. So all of those things together and more lead up to the fact that most of these things at some level or other are actually about how we're connecting as humans in the workplace. So I just want to share a couple of quotes with you that really kind of, you know, bring to light exactly what we mean by human connection. So this one here, by Donna, I can't ever pronounce her name correctly, but Donna Piscano Brown. So human connection is an energy exchange between people who are paying attention to one another. And those two things, energy exchange, it's an exchange, it's two-way, and it's about paying attention to one another. And I'm going to come back to that on things that we can do. And there are some more things here about, having the power to deepen the moment, inspire change, build trust. These are all human characteristics of what creates real human relationships. The next quote on the next page I just wanted to share is a bit briefer, but just says it's not an exchange of information, it's an exchange of humanity, it's an exchange of emotion. And I think sometimes if you think about one-to-ones in organisations, so lots of people will have their one-to-ones with their team, think, yes, I've got one-to-ones with my team, I'm connecting with them. When you get under the skin of, well, what do you talk about? What are those conversations about? And I've had these conversations with many people. Very often they are exchanges of information, they're task updates, they're what's happening with this, they're what's happening with that. That is important, but there often isn't the space of a real connection and an exchange of humanity. So it isn't I'm the manager and I'm checking in on you, but this is us exchanging as two human beings. So I thought those two quotes were quite helpful in just really drilling into what do we really mean.
Paula, that's really, really interesting. And I really love those quotes. And for those of you that don't know, I'm a bit biased because I love our approach and our platform, but the reason for that is we go way beyond the standard engagement index, leadership index, whatever indice we want to measure. And we also have the focus on emotional analytics. And what's crazy is new clients that come on board that were so focused on, Lucy, we still need our indice for this and indice for that. Don't worry, you'll still get that. But often they will then run surveys where they just use the first two questions, which is the how do you feel and the why. So the emotional based questions, because as Jodie said earlier, it gives you everything you need to know. But yeah, Paula, I just love those quotes. Sorry.
Yeah, and I think it does really get to the heart of what are we really talking about here. And I know we'll get into this in the discussion. I just thank you for that. Let's just nip on to my last thing I just wanted to share, which was just a little bit. So this is adapted from occupational psychologist Bailey and French. And just to highlight, here's an example of 4 key things that really drill deeper, that make a difference to really create that connection. The first one is about removing judgment. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the model of the ladders of inference. If you aren't, you can look it up, ladder of inference. It's really quite interesting about how quickly we judge people in organisations. We're all guilty of it, actually. But how do we maintain a culture where we can come out of that and see people with what they call unconditional positive regard? So people are doing their best. So therefore, how do I meet someone with curiosity rather than judgment? It makes a huge difference to the way people feel in an organisation. The second one that they talk about here is sharing vulnerability. And I think there's a real place for the senior line manager to stand up and say, I too have had a mental health problem, and this is my story. However, there's another level and a layer of depth to that, which is not about just sharing it, right, so now you know I'm human, but the reciprocity that comes as a result of sharing those stories, the ability to be able to share stories backwards and forwards. The third one is about shifting our levels of listening. And I mean, gosh, I think this is a result of sort of being quite busy and wanting to get things done. But sometimes we find ourselves in listening to reply and really trying to create that consciousness of listening actively to hear and then to reply, and really finding ways of creating that in a culture to create that space. And the fourth one is about reflection and summarising back. So one of the most important things we know for someone to feel a sense of belonging and feel a sense of connection, sense of value, is that they have been heard. The best way of someone feeling heard is that I have this conversation with you and you summarize back to me, so what I think I heard you say was. And it doesn't have to create agreement, but the sense of feeling heard is a huge part of that emotional connection. So running through those quickly, because I want to get us to the more opportunity to discuss a few things, but we wanted to make sure that not only do we share with you what our data tells us, but here are also some insights and some reminders about the things that really make a difference when we're trying to build human connection that is meaningful and will shift those emotional indicators for you. Lucy. This is just something to share. We'll keep it in the slides, but it's a resource for you in terms of this is something that we often will look at, which is kind of saying, you know, a lot of emotions actually come back to, if you bring them back to the core, a few core themes as well. So we've popped this in here if you haven't come across it before as a resource as well.
Brilliant. Thank you, Paula. Thank you, Jodie. We will take questions, so please put them in the chat box. I also have a couple, but I just want to signpost. We probably have about 10 minutes left. Give you some time to grab a coffee or some lunch before your next meeting. Do stay till the end because Paula is going to share her top resources, which are going to be super, super powerful. So don't miss that key takeaway. Paula, I guess one of my questions is, how would we help leaders handle learning about how their people feel if they haven't had that kind of data before?
Yeah, so quite often a lot of the data will have come in more traditional employee survey questions, and the emotion will be more of an intuitive conversation about it rather than the data. So I think there's a couple of really useful things. I mean, one is having the data in and of itself, I think, creates access to a conversation about emotions that, you know, is difficult not to have. So I think really getting to grips with it and understanding those correlations and the relationships between the data is super important. So that's number one. But number two, I think, is that at the end of the day, we sometimes have these conversations with a willingness, with a desire to get to the action planning as soon as possible. So what's the problem and what's the action? And so I think there is a real challenge for all of us to pause at the beginning of the conversation, to meet the conversation as a human being, rather than as a leader in an organization trying to make it better. And so, you know, whilst it might sometimes feel, even for us, challenging, I think we have to step into that space where we start a conversation by saying, it's important, isn't it, how we how we feel. When is it when you feel like this? When do you feel like that? Trying to get them just into their own sense of humanness and sense of self in order to meet the data as a human, rather than meeting the data as, you know, an action planner, if you like. So they would be the two things that I would say.
Yeah, I love that. And actually, you know, with everything that's happened over the past 2 years, it does certainly feel more natural, probably more natural for some organizations compared to others, but to start talking more about how people are feeling definitely feels more intuitive. So I'm a big lover of practicality. So for everyone listening, the data is really important. We need data to make key business decisions. But practically, what do our listeners need to kind of go away and do?
That's me. So, I mean, I think there's two things that get in the way of a conversation, a real conversation about the feeling, and then how do you build it into everything? And the first one is time, and the second one is task. And I sort of sometimes describe this a little bit like the masculine and feminine sides of the way we lead, and where it's so important that we're leading human systems in a human way, and we want to create that connection because we know the evidence has just told us it's really important to pay attention to this. It actually does require us to create shifts in the way we use our time. So you cannot create human connection in those sort of short sound bites, in those short, you know, you sometimes need to have space for longer conversation, for conversation that isn't just about the output. So, and for going a little deeper with somebody, because it then releases them to get on with the work, right? It is both the same. It's not a conversation just for the sake of it. So I think there's something about time and balancing and rebalancing our time to make sure that we've got the opportunity to do those things. I mean, back in the day, I mean, this is not new. It used to be called management by walking about. I mean, it's about building the time into the calendar for that connective opportunity. And then I think, and holding ourselves to the discipline of that. And the other one is task. So hugely we are driven by task. But the bigger outcome usually in all of the things we've got in our organisation in terms of values, in terms of outcomes, in terms of bigger picture, the tasks lead to that, but so does the behaviours of the organisation. And so as the leader, we should be spending our time on both task and behaviours. And so it is valid that our time and our energy is focused on both task and behavioural aspects of our job. It's not the nice to have when we've got enough time when we're not doing the task. And that mindset shift needs to be role modelled by anyone and everyone who's willing to take a bit of a risk that their calendar looks different on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. We've got another question, which is, what is your advice on how to tackle feedback in a small organisation when the senior team are less open to change or less open to listening without judgment?
I'll say a little something, and Jodie, you might have a view on this as well, because you're often in the middle of these conversations as well. I mean, I would use the evidence, to be perfectly honest with you, and I think this is where this is, and I don't know, Pippa, since it's your question, the background to this, and it'd be useful maybe have a follow-up conversation if you're interested. But so often I think we are trying to have these conversations because, you know, intuitively we know, or we're trying to pull something more out of other data. You know, if we can actually really rely on the evidence, it's really difficult to have a conversation about it. So that retention data that says, if you're interested in retention because it costs you money not to be interested in it, and retention rates are higher than what you want to do, so you've got to match this data with your retention data or your attraction data. You know, you then basically say, well, we know that this is based on these feelings. Therefore, we know if we take action to help with how people feel, we will make a difference to this outcome, and therefore the outcome on your attrition. So I think, you know, in those sorts of organisations, you've got to link it to the data, and you've got to link it to the bottom line somehow. And I think it's been difficult to do that to a large extent. But if you've got the opportunity to do that and you can get that level of data, that's where I would go.
And we often find, I think, when there's always a couple of them that are a bit nervous or not willing to be a bit more open, but there always is someone that you can kind of have on your team that does agree with the approach or does agree with the outcomes that you're trying to achieve, and it's kind of building it up that way. So Jodie, is there anything else to add on that point from you?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd actually just add on what you've just said there around people feeling nervous. I think what is worth remembering here is when it's a senior team, they're still people. And actually, why are they less open? Why do they come across judgmental? Why do you perceive them in that way? Very likely that they are fearful. That is generally where those things come from. It's their own emotions that are controlling their behavior there. And it does usually come back to fear. And I think part of that, there's almost two parts there. There's sort of acknowledging that because they're human as well. It might be new for them. That fear is fine. But there's what do we do next? Is it then sort of brushed under the carpet and left where it is going to sort of fester, if you like, and continue to cause issues? Or do we kind of encourage and accept that actually, even as a senior team, it might be new for them. They're still going to make mistakes around it. And we need to, it's a culture thing almost where it goes two ways, where, again, what Paula was saying on the, it being a sort of reciprocal relationship to go to both sides there and allow that space for it to take time for it to change, rather than expect necessarily that it's got something that's going to change overnight. So it is an interesting one. We do see a lot of that in senior teams. And I would say from experience that it comes down to their fear of what they're going to hear, what they're going to find out.
Yeah, thanks, Jodie. Really great addition there. Greg has asked, is there an optimal timeshare, Paula, between the task and the behaviour from the manager's point of view?
I love that question. No, no, and and but my answer to it would be just spend more time, more time on the behaviours, because and one of the things I actually do when I coach leaders, I was actually doing this yesterday, having a conversation with somebody in a pretty senior position, um, uh, having quite an impact on lots of people and themselves, actually, may I say. We literally did a diary check. I mean, as simple as that. So literally set out, what am I trying to achieve? What culture am I trying to achieve? What tasks am I trying to achieve? Actually list it both out. And then when you know what you're trying to achieve, go back and look in and say, what time am I spending on it? What time have I spent it on the last 2 weeks? And what can I change in the next 2 weeks that will be different? So I don't necessarily think it's about, a 50-50 split or anything like that, because of course my HR answer would be it depends. But I think there are practical things that people can do to challenge themselves to make sure that there is more emphasis proactively protected in their calendar time for the real connective activity that's part of their job. And what they'll find is if they do more of that, they'll have less task to do, because the escalations won't happen as much, because people's confidence will boost, etc., etc. There's a virtuous circle that starts to create.
Awesome. Final question. We're going to give everyone a few minutes back. So does it really matter if a line manager is an introvert or an extrovert when it comes to connecting and talking about emotions?
So my feeling on this is introvert or extrovert. No, it doesn't matter, in that that's a continuum anyway, and so there's lots of tunes to play on introversion and extroversion. And also, introversion and extroversion is a preference. It isn't what you actually are. So even if you have a preference for one or the other, you can consciously make choices about how you show up for yourself and other people. The only thing I think is a watch out for an introvert is that there are ways of communicating that are easier. I'm an introvert than others, so it's easier to hide a little bit behind, particularly now, to hide a little bit behind the sort of the Zoom screen and the emails and the Teams chat, than to actually physically get out and have more of the real face-to-face connection, which does make a difference. And for the extroverts, there's a real chance that there's not enough listening going on, not enough space. So when you ask someone a question, is there enough space for them to have thought about what you've asked them and answer before you continue the conversation and haven't given them a chance to speak? So I think there's watch outs if you have those preferences, but I do think anyone can play the whole gamut. It is much more, really, to me, Lucy, about being aware and making conscious choices, intentional choices about how you want to show up for yourself and for others.
Brilliant. Thank you, Paula. Well, everyone, we're going to pull that to a close. If you did have any other questions, please feel free to email them over and we will come back to you. But I just wanted to finish off with Paula sharing her top resources.
So on this subject of human connection, I've got 3 things. Some of you might already be familiar with these, so if you are, awesome. I'd love you to give a big thumbs up. But I've got 1 podcast and 2 books that it's quite useful to look at if you really want to get into this subject. The podcast that I love, which is a culture-based podcast, is by Bruce Daisley. And I think he used to run Twitter, actually the MD of Twitter in the UK, but now kind of works more broadly. His is called Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat. So we'll get these links to you. But that's a fab podcast, and there's a big back catalogue, and it's quite a fun discussion as well, and they're quite short. So anything on culture and feelings, that's quite good. Some of you might have come across this book here. It's called No Hard Feelings. If you follow along on Instagram, you sometimes see the pictures or illustrations from Liz Fosslin and Molly West. But this is a really fun, interesting read, quite good to give to some of your leaders as easy access to start to think about how feelings work, and even introduce some of the pictures into some of your meetings to just start a conversation. So I really love that one. If you want to go a bit deeper, and this is not a work-based book, but if you're interested in the whole piece about judgment and ego and all of those pieces, this is my favorite book ever, and it's called A New Earth. It's by Eckhart Tolle. It may feel this is always in the spiritual list if you go into Waterstones or anywhere, but in actual fact, it's really applicable if you're interested in human behaviour and helping to make a difference with that for yourself and then for others. So they are my top resources.
Thank you, Paula. And yes, I will share the links to those next week. We've also just had a question about the recording. It will be sent out next week, so please keep an eye on that. And if you don't get it by Wednesday, please do email me, because it would have definitely been sent by then. I just want to signpost you all to our next webinar. It is next Thursday, the 10th of February at 1 p.m. with lastminute.com. So we're really excited. Please do keep an eye out for that. And as I say, have a lovely afternoon, everyone. And we'll speak soon.